Good morning, Corky Alexander here. I thought I would give a little talk here on Vance Havner because recently my daughter Emma and I went on a trip to see one of my new grandsons, and it took us through, Georgia and Virginia, and so that I was talking to Emma, and she was asking me some questions riding in the car, which prompted me to share some background about some of the Christian ministry people that I've known and experiences I had in the 26 years that I was a pastor. Also, the other years when I was an itinerant preacher, all the while music was going on too. But in particular, formal ministry as an ordained minister, pastoring churches and so forth like that. Emma is funny because Emma, when she was younger and little, she would often make remarks about these old preachers, especially John Wesley and people like that, about them being creepy. And so this is a talk about some more creepy things to younger generations who don't have, the elderly in view so much. I am doing these videos. Some are formal instruction, like guitar. Others are about things I don't know how to do, like model trains, and I'm learning. And I find that people who do videos about learning things teaches as much as those who are journeymen or experienced people per se. Vance Havner, I was pastoring in Greensboro, North Carolina, at Glad Tidings Church, and this was 1979 and 80. I'd already been traveling quite a bit with my wife's family, doing Southern gospel music, and then I also preached, revivals and youth camps at this time before I was offered to accept the pastorate there in Greensboro. I was working full time as a draftsman at a mechanical contractor. So I was involved in a type of art, technical drawing, and then I was involved with music, traveling, playing guitar, Southern Gospel Group, and others. I had my own music that I was creating for acoustic, solo, writing songs, things like that. And then being a minister, a formal minister of a church. So while I was at the Glad Tidings Church, it slowed me down enough from traveling that I discovered that Dr. Vance Havner lived in an apartment near the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. And a friend of mine, David McGee, a fellow minister, dear friend, out of Collinsville, Virginia at that time, had more or less introduced me to Vance Havner's books. And I knew that there had been a number of ministers that had visited Dr. Havner at his apartment in Greensboro, and that he would welcome young ministers. So with David's help, I located Dr. Havner's telephone number, and he was a Baptist evangelist, but he was not like only Southern Baptist. he had other involvements, like he was involved in Keswick camp meetings and things like that. He told me when I met him that he'd never preached anywhere but Southern Baptist churches. But looking at the history, I know that's not true. But I called him on the phone and asked him if I could stop by and visit with him, and I did. And he was very hard to get to know. And I would visit him a number of times. I don't remember how many, maybe 10, 12, maybe something like that, over the next couple of years while I was pastoring in Greensboro. And for those of you who don't know who Vance Havner is or was, he was more or less a humorist slash evangelist and a writer. He was in the order of Leonard Ravenhill, David Wilkerson. He was in that order. And these were ministers who were preaching about holiness and, prayer. And so in visiting him, when he would come to the door, he was very old. He's in his 80s. And he had these spindly little legs. I remember he just walked, kind of trembled when he walked. And he would open the door of the apartment and he would turn his back on me and walk back to the couch to sit down. And I would follow him in, shut the door, and then sit down. We would talk. One point, I called him to come over, and I think it was mostly Mondays that I went. And, he would say something like, "Why do you want to come over?" And I would say, "Well, just to talk. Guys like you are not always going to be on the earth with us, and we need to glean as much as we can from your experience," things like that. So he would let me come over. I remember his apartment was small. I remember at the dining room table, his typewriter was a manual typewriter that he wrote 30 books on. His most famous one, I think, being "Though I Walk Through the Valley," about his wife's death. And so in our talks, sometimes he will have just returned from preaching for A.W. Tozer in the Alliance Church of Chicago on Sunday. Sometimes he will have preached for Jerry Falwell in Lynchburg, Virginia, the Sunday before the Monday that I came over. And it was always very interesting to hear his reflections on those people. The two things that I want to emphasize about Vance Havner, number one is his humor, how he integrated humor into his ministry. And he's very quotable. Often preachers would say, "The clock struck 12 and the church gave up her dead." Or maybe another quote from Vance Havner would be, "Some churches you have to backslide in order to have fellowship." And then his comment about dark restaurants, where he got his sermon, "Getting Used to the Dark." He talked about how your eyes get used to the dark. And he said, when you go into these dark restaurants, you have to eat by faith and not by sight. And things like this that he would say, it would be in his books and things like that. He was a man who never owned an automobile until he was in his 50s. And Billy Graham gave him that automobile. And he didn't marry until late in life, I think 50s or 60s. And he suffered from insomnia. I would say probably if he was diagnosed today, he would be diagnosed as clinical depression. and suffered with depression. And when I would go to hear him speak at local churches, um, he would turn into a totally different man in a pulpit than he was at home. At home, he was a very gloomy man, very dark, not funny. Uh, but when he would enter the pulpit, he would turn into something else. And he was heavily under demand as a speaker. I believe he was booked up 3 years ahead, and he was known to double and triple book himself. Um, and whatever pastor came by the apartment, picked him up, was the one he preached for that day. And the others might come later. So he had this way about him of doing that. He suffered from insomnia the earlier part of his life, and when he pastored the First Baptist Church of Charleston, South Carolina, he lived in a boarding house. The woman that was sent to take him his meals, he ended up marrying. And the day he married her, he did not have insomnia until the day she died. And then when she died, the insomnia returned, and he was suffering from it when I was associating with him. So I guess the first thing, integrating humor into ministry or into preaching is something not everybody's able to do. And he helped me to do that. And then the second thing would have been depression as a reality, even in ministers and people who are so-called saints. Many of them suffer from depression, and it's very real, and I do, for sure. For a blues guitar player, it's probably a ministry tool to be depressed. But it's what you do with depression. Depression's not something wicked or evil. The psalmist David wrote about his depression a number of times in the Psalms. Why art thou cast down, O my soul? I will yet hope in God. And so depression is very real. It's not a matter of whether you're going to be depressed. It's a matter of what you do with it. And so he really taught me that no matter how famous a person you are or minister you are, you might suffer from depression, and not to quit, but to keep plowing through it. And so that was always an inspiration to me. When he passed away, I was, I believe, conducting a youth revival in Lexington, North Carolina. His funeral was to be at First Baptist Greensboro, and I went with a couple of ministers, one of them being more or less my spiritual father, Tommy D. Fuqua, and we attended the funeral service, which was conducted by Dr. Billy Graham, and George Beverly Shea sang. Brother Fuqua was wary of TV cameras because of an experience he had in Raleigh, North Carolina, where he was challenged publicly by Bob Harrington, the chaplain of Bourbon Street. And so from that point on, Brother Fuqua tried to avoid TV cameras. So he told me when we sat down at the funeral service, he said, we're going to go out the back door because we don't want to get on those cameras that are going to greet Dr. Graham when he goes out the side. Well, we did that. We went around the sanctuary on the outside, and our cars parked on the side, and we happened to get to the door just at the time Dr. Graham stepped out, and then I got to meet Billy Graham and talk to him a couple of minutes, and it was a very powerful experience for me. So I knew Dr. Vance Havner. I sat at his typewriter where he wrote 30 books, approximately. And I appreciated his ministry and his example. I tried to get him to come across town and preach at my little Pentecostal church, but he told me he wouldn't do that. And he said, "What do they speak in tongues?" And I said, "Yes, sir, they do." And he said, "My people are so afraid to go out on a limb that they never climb the tree." So Vance Havner, the stories that he told me about Tozer, no, I've never seen any book, and that might be something for a later talk. Y'all have a blessed day.